For Mel Torme.
Mel Torme. All right, so let's begin again. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. A reading from the book of Exodus. The Lord came down in a cloud. So the Lord passed before Moses and proclaimed, the Lord, a God gracious and merciful, slow to anger, abounding in love and fidelity, continuing his love for 1,000 generations, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin, yet not declaring the guilty innocent, but bringing punishment upon the wickedness of the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So I want to do this class on the anger of God because it's actually kind of clever. In the Bible, the anger doesn't mean what you think it means, the anger of God. Also, so we're going to have 3 classes on this. This next class will talk about how that affects Catholic liturgy. So just at the end, I'm just kind of curious if you guys could guess, well, what part of the Mass do we kind of bring up this idea of God's anger? But another problem is that really it doesn't say God's anger in the Bible. What it says is it could translate as that his nostrils were long, which is a strange image. But what it says is, there's a joke about how Minnesotans fight, because Minnesotans are very gentle people, and they had this huge gang fight in Minnesota. So these 2 groups lined up to each other, and they both went like this, and then walked away. So I just mentioned that because when it says long nose, it means like, how you snort sometimes when you're upset and just, that's what it means. Or it can be translated, your nose, God's nose burned hot, which I just think is kind of funny. And anybody want to guess when is the first time that in the Bible it says that God's nose burned hot? When is the first time it actually says God gets angry? Not Adam and Eve. Not Cain and Abel. We're talking a long ways. The first time it's mentioned, and this is kind of shocking, is God gets angry with Moses in Exodus. So that's in Exodus 3, and there's 50 chapters in Genesis. So 54 chapters into the book is when God gets angry. So when it says God is slow to get angry, God is really slow. Like that's thousands and thousands of years before God's nose burns hot. Isn't that kind of interesting? So when people say, "Oh, God seems so angry in the Old Testament," I don't know. Have you read it? Because really, that's really not true. And people always like to say, "Well, God gets angry, therefore my anger is I'm just like God." Really, if you're angry, if you can go several eons without getting angry, then you're like God. It doesn't say God doesn't get angry. It says God is very slow to get angry. Oddly enough, God never gets angry in the book of Genesis. Now, it was the outcry of the oppressed that first gets God upset. Actually, what it says is pained. So, with the blood of Abel and this Noah, it actually is God is pained, not angry. God gets angry for the first time, actually in Exodus, with the oppression of Egypt. But the first time it says God gets angry, it's at Moses, not Egypt. And that should shock you. And where it comes from is, God comes to Moses and asks him to speak out and lead the people. And Moses 5 times says he doesn't want to. He says, I stutter, which Moses did have supposedly a speech impediment. 5 times God asks Moses to lead the people, and at the final one, it says God's nose burned hot. And then he immediately comes up and finds a way to deal with Moses' insecurity. He says, well, I'll have Aaron speak for you then. So after 5 times of begging Moses, God does get angry, but it's only for an instant. And he immediately comes up with a way around it. So the prophet resisted him 5 times, and that's followed by this quick act of mercy. I think that's amazing. Now, what I want to underline is that the first time God shows anger is to a religious person. So you'll start to notice this strange theme that God gets most upset, not with, the Egyptians or the Babylonians or the people from Star. God gets angry most with religious people. That's a really strange twist. And the second time God gets angry is really the parting of the Red Sea. So it says the wind of his nostrils blew back the sea and held back the water. But think about this. Even with that, God gives 10 chances to the biggest, baddest villain in the Old Testament so far, Pharaoh. And then even warns the soldiers with this pillar of fire. So God gives them multiple chances to turn back. He gave Moses 5 chances. He gives Pharaoh 10 chances to change. And then God's anger grows hot. Does that make sense? So once again, it really shows how slow God is. And the third incident is the golden calf. And that's when God gets angry at the people for not trusting him and breaking their relationship with him. So that just strikes me as so strange that with all the oppression of Egypt, it's mostly with religious people. And here's the theme that you notice. And that tells us something about God's anger. God's anger is like this divine anchor. Now, what do I mean by a divine anchor? So let's just review what we've already said. And then we'll return to the golden calf story. The whole narrative of the biblical story is God appoints human beings to be his representatives on earth. And in the garden, they rebel. They want to get a blessing and power by their own way. So they take from the tree of selfishness, and they're exiled. But here's the weird part. So they broke the one law God gave them. And God promises them that one day the snake crusher would come and free humanity. So humanity sins, and God makes a promise to free them. Humanity continues after that to continue to be corrupt. And they ruin the land through violence and bloodshed. This is the Noah story. And the flood comes. And then after the flood, God appoints a new humanity, Noah and his family, to be his representatives on earth. And God makes a covenant with Noah that God will suffer the pain caused, then let humanity feel the effects of our own actions. So once again, humanity sins, and God makes a promise. And then humanity, it goes and repeats everything again. The same thing Adam and Eve did, the same thing Noah's kids. So God keeps trying this new strategy of investing one particular family out of all the families of the world. And that's going to be Abraham. So pretty much from Abraham forward, you have this pattern that the more corrupt that human beings become, the more tightly God binds himself to one particular family through all these covenants. And these covenants, oddly enough, create more demand on God and less on us. God keeps committing and investing himself, allowing certain people to represent him. And unfortunately, they're no better than the other people. And these covenants keep costing God more obligations, but it's we human beings who keep breaking it. So by the time you get to Sinai, God promises to marry himself to these people. Anyhow, and what you'll see is God gets most angry in the New Testament at the people who are closest to him. Oddly enough, God has the biggest emotional reaction against religious people who let him down versus the pagans. But really, if you think about that, isn't that kind of true of us human beings? Don't you have the biggest emotional reaction against a spouse versus a stranger? If a stranger did it, it'd be no big deal. But if it's your husband or wife who does it, why can't you respect me? Does that make any sense? So going back to so do you get the pattern that, wow, every time humanity sins, God binds himself closer to us. Doesn't become more distance, becomes even closer. Do you see the pattern there? So back to the golden calf. So on their wedding night between God and humanity at Sinai, God is going to marry Israel. The people are caught having an affair just after God frees them. The affair is with the golden calf. And it says, God's nose burned hot. And God tells, listen to this is amazing. God tells Moses, because now he's upset, tells Moses to give him rest, quote unquote, so that his anger may come up and, quote unquote, finish the people. Well, think about that. I'll use myself as an example. Anger is one of my really go-to emotions. I don't have to say, Jen, back off and give me some time so I can get angry. It happens 0 to 60. So that's actually kind of funny. So the first thing is it takes God time to work up his anger. And he has to tell Moses, don't pray to him so he can work up his anger. And of course, Moses continues to pray and talk to God so he'd forget his anger. And he uses the words rest and finish. Those words are theological words. Those are religious words. Rest, when I say rest, what do you think of? What's that?
Sleep.
Oh, well, actually, I was hoping you'd go for the Sabbath. The Sabbath rest. That's a term for Sabbath. Or if I say finish, I'll give you that one. The word finish keeps coming up in the Genesis story, where at the end of every day it says it's finished. And the end of every day, when the word finish comes up, just means that, well, the next day is going to be a whole new beginning, a whole new form of life is going to burst forth. So even Jesus at the cross says, it is finished on the cross. It means a whole new type of life is going to start after that. And that's the church. So it's interesting that God gets more angry with religious people. It's also interesting that the prayers of a holy man, Moses, can displace the injustice of a whole supposedly religious people. And I think it's important because there's actually this part that's a messianic trajectory in the Old Testament, that these people are selected out of all the nations to get God's blessing, but it also makes them more liable to God's justice than the average person. So the non-religious person is not as obligated to be faithful to God. But when people that God set free, who made wedding vows, are not faithful, this gets God angry. So at least this helps us begin to think about God's intense anger in the Old Testament more like a spouse who's been cheated on. So when people say, well, God seems to get so angry in the Old Testament, well, first, it takes centuries. And secondly, God mostly gets angry out of those who made promises of love. And what if, let's say you're married and your spouse keeps telling you that they love you but cheating on you? I don't think that's love. So when I say God's love works as a divine anchor, every time God gets angry, he binds himself more to us human beings. So I hate to say it, that's the good news of God's anger. Wow, when we really mess up and God gets angry, he makes more of a promise to us. So that's the third time God gets angry. I just want to pause there. Does that make sense what I said about a divine anger? Because most people, if they get really angry with you, they sever the relationship. They don't intensify it. Okay, makes sense? Move on. Okay, fourth, the spies into the land. This is the longest of the rebellion stories. And so they get to the border of the promised land and they send in spies or scouts. And the scouts, they're scared. So they decide to lie. And they say, oh, it's a land filled with giants. And if we read the passage, they take back a tree and its fruits. It's actually grapes, but remember in Hebrew, went over this before, a grapevine is considered a tree. So they bring back a tree and its fruit. When I say tree and fruit, what does that story, does that remind you of?
Garden.
Good job. The garden. And so they have tree and fruit. And remember, every time the theme tree comes up, it means people are making a moral choice between good and selfishness. So they have this tree and the fruit, and they come back and they tell the story about these giants and all this other stuff. And then people say, well, we'll die. We go into the promised land, we'll die, and our children will suffer. So let's go back to Egypt. And God leads them to the promised land. And then on the edge, they get cold feet. That's when God gets angry, because they're rejecting God and the promised land. So Moses speaks to God and says, well, let me remind you, you're slow to anger. And God says, okay, I forgive him. Like, that's a really quick forgiveness, by the way, because if I get angry, just work out. You can ask for forgiveness, and I guarantee you I will forgive you as soon as I calm down. Just give me like 10 years. But God forgives immediately. But here's the bad part. But the people grumbled, constantly complaining, and didn't want to enter the promised land. So God is going to make them live out their choices. They didn't want to enter the promised land, so they're not going to enter the promised land. They'll wander in the desert 1 year for every day of complaining, which is 40. But their children won't suffer. God's not going to reject the children. The children will come and enter into the promised land. So just remember that class I had on trees, that anytime a tree shows up, means you're going to make a choice. And whatever choice you make in front of a tree, you're going to be obligated to live out. So it's just working off that theme. So God shows mercy, but makes them live out their choice. What that passage said is God is slow to anger, quick on mercy. But then it also says, God says, I will not declare innocent those who are not innocent. So people often forget the second half of the sentence. Yes, God is slow to anger and merciful, but will make us live out our choices. I will not declare innocent those who are not innocent. And this is a hard thing for a lot of people to understand. God doesn't give amnesty. God gives mercy. So I know I've said this too much, but there's this huge difference between amnesty and forgiveness. Amnesty means I'm just going to pretend like there is no offense there. I'm going to pretend like it never happened and you never have to change. God never does that. So like I know one mother who always offers her children amnesty, and they never improve. They keep just doubling down. Mercy, that incorporates change. Does that make sense? So the other point is that God always gives us what we want. They said they wanted the promised land. They said they didn't want the promised land. That's going to be death. So God gives them what they want, death outside the promised land. They don't want to enter the promised land, so they won't. But their children never chose that, so they'll enter into the promised land. So the point is, we shouldn't pray that God, the point is that we should pray that God does not give us what we want, but what we need. We're really not that good at recognizing the difference between want and need. And the other issue is that God's anger, in a way, it protects us from wanting the wrong thing. We human beings are always wanting the wrong thing. And so, like, this priest tells a story that when he was a little kid, he remembers praying for a Corvette because he just loved a Corvette. And, there's always these vocation talks to the church, so he always wanted two things, a Corvette and never to become a priest. And so he got the Corvette. He gets the Corvette and he loved it and he was thrilled. But, after time, the Corvette dulls. Like, it's just a Corvette. Does that make sense? And this twist of fate, in his kind of searching for what fulfills him in life, he ends up becoming a priest. So what he thought he wanted didn't make him happy. And what he didn't want, being a priest, in this end, it makes him happy. Or there's St. Philip Neri, who, if anytime you hear the name Philip Neri, he loved to laugh and joke. And he would say this prayer, and I think this is pretty funny. His prayer was, "Never give me what I think I want." That's what he'd say to God. Isn't that hilarious? And God's judgment on us is like this. God will give us what we want. If we want death, that's what God will give us. God will let us go. God will beg and entice and warn, but in the end, it's our choice. So there's this twist that human beings will say, God is angry and we won't get what we want. When God gives us what we want, that really means a form of punishment. So it's the opposite. When God gives us what we want, that's God's anger. When God doesn't give us what we want, that's actually God's mercy. Does that make sense? So there's this other phrase that keeps coming up in the Bible, that when this phrase come up, people might read it like, oh, well, God got angry. It doesn't say God got angry. There's this phrase that says, God hid his face. What does it mean that God hid his face? So remember, the one goal in the Bible is to see the face of God. That's what Moses wanted. Now, Moses technically didn't see the face of God. He saw his back. Or Aaron's blessing is to see the face of God. So this little phrase, hiding his face, sometimes people will interpret it as anger or punishment, but that's actually how you should not interpret it. It is kind of both. God hiding his face is kind of like this. Many saints describe that in their prayer life, this dry period. That's what St. Therese of Lisieux called it. Or St. Teresa called it God's hiding his face. So they say, like St. Therese, she says, when she was a little girl, she loved to pray. And when she prayed, it was very fruitful. She always had this euphoric feeling when she prayed. And then God hid his face. And the euphoric feeling never came. And here's the odd part. She starts to rationalize with herself and she says, but wait a minute, if I was praying so I get the euphoric feeling, then that's no credit to me. I wasn't praying for God. I was praying for what I could get from God. So she comes to this conclusion, well, this is a good thing. God should hide his face from me so that I desire God for God's sake, not for anything more. And so she considered God hiding his face part of a way of purifying her desire for God itself. So is God hiding his face punishment or a way to maturity? And just thinking about this, like one of our parishioners told the story, Gary Roman, where Gary Roman was in a construction company, and his son, who he claims is one of the highest IQs, super, super smart, could have done anything in his life, but he loves being a mechanic. But like his parents say, he is the smartest person. He knows everything. His memory is just incredible. But my point being is that, wow, they're smart, and they're in the construction mechanic stuff, and they're watching their grandson out the window. And the grandson, is this thing working still? Oh, did it stop? It's there. Hello? Hello?
There it is.
Well, yeah, if I put my mouth right on it. What happened?
I don't know. Let me get a battery.
Well, it says green. Oh, wires. Okay, another thing, serve order. Another thing is don't bend tiny wires. I am a terrible person because it was driving me up a wall that, well, a lot of things drive me up a wall. But the deacons, when they'd use the mics, would put it in and then wrap it around the thing, which the wire is not meant to bend the thing. So this, I forgot, this wire there is going out because people wrap it around. And I just hope God gets angry with them for wrapping the wire and gives them a canker sore. Don't wrap the wire. Anyhow, what was I talking about? Gary. So they see their grandson, and he's struggling to put something together. And Gary says, "Oh, don't worry, I'll go out and help him." And his son says, "No, don't help him. Let him struggle. He'll have to figure it out." And grandparents are kind of soft. And Gary says, "Are you sure? I can go out. I know how to fix it." He says, "No, I want him to struggle." Don't you kind of like that story that maybe the real act, the best act is to let somebody struggle, to hide? Doesn't mean that God isn't watching over, but God has hid his face so that we learn to desire God, not, did it go out again? Desire God for God's self. Okay, how about that? I think I'm going to switch to the other mic, because that's not working, is it?
Should we try a new battery?
No, I want you to find the person who keeps bending the wire. No, I put up signs that say, "Don't bend the wire." And then you find it all crumpled up, bent up. Clearly, God is going to get angry with them. Okay, can you hear me? Is that working? Hello? Hello?
You have to write it.
Okay, we'll try that again. Don't bend the wire. Is that? Okay, does that make sense? Oh, okay. Can you guys hear okay online? Can you guys hear?
Yes.
Okay, Jen, somebody just called you on your cell phone, by the way. Do you want me to tell you what the message says? Okay. Okay, where was I? Oh, so the Bible keeps using this phrase of God hiding his face. And yeah, when God hides his face, it's very difficult. Look at like Mother Teresa. She didn't want her diary published, but the priest published it because she went years without any sort of reconciliation from God. It was this long, dark night. But non-Christians will say, see, she didn't have faith. But no, all the great saints had that sometimes God hides his face so that we learn to desire God more. So to see God and to live in his life is our goal, but God hiding his face actually happens in Genesis 1 and 2. So at the very beginning of Genesis, there's darkness and disorder. And the disorder, from the disorder comes a new creation, even more holy. So when God hides his face, it means, it's going to be hard on us, but from disorder has going to come a better relationship with God. It's not punishment. It is hard, but it's not punishment. So a lot of times when it mentions that stuff about God's hiding his face, people say, oh, see, once again, God got angry. Maybe God is just giving us what's best for us. So you have this contrast of God hiding his face, but you also have the opposite of humans hiding from God. So the opposite of that, of God hiding his face, is us hiding. And the basic claim of the Torah is that human beings actually don't want to be close to God because the real God can't be managed. So we hide from God. Adam and Eve, when they sinned, what did they do? They hid from God. We just hide in more sophisticated ways. better excuses: workaholism, recreation, religion, materialism, patriotism. Sometimes are a way of just a more elaborate way of hiding. Does that make sense, or do I have to explain those? So yes, sometimes even religion, think of the Pharisees, is a way of distancing yourself from God. That's a real twist. What's that? So sometimes when it says God hid his face, it also means that we're hiding from God. It could mean our previous understanding of God was so insufficient it won't work. But my point is, God hiding his face is not anger. It's hard, but it's a benefit for us. And also, it's a way of us from stopping from hiding from God. Now, so you have God's anger. So that's God's anger in the Old Testament, at least the first couple times. But then, like when I said, well, when is the first time God gets angry? And somebody said the Garden of Eden, right? Or Noah. Well, nowhere does it say that God got angry. So I just want to offer this contrast. There's God getting angry and what happens when we're outside of our relationship with God. That's two separate incidences. So there's very few example of God's anger, but it's always with quick forgiveness. The worst thing that could happen is not God getting angry with us. Because if God gets angry with us, he'll just draw him closer. The worst thing that can happen is when God withdraws from us. That's actually the terrible stuff. So the first one is Adam and Eve's fall. And you know the story, so I'm not going to repeat, but the snake says that they won't die. And this is called the cut flower analogy, which I've used before, but use it like this. If I see beautiful flowers and I cut them, well, technically they're still alive or dead. I'm not really sure, but they're beautiful. But cut off from the source, they will die. So the snake says, oh, surely you will not die. Well, you won't die immediately, but the thing that gives you life, you'll be cut off from. And in the Garden of Eden, there was perfect shalom. And shalom means peace, but it also means unity. And for you to have shalom, you have to be in right relationship between you and God, right relationship between you and other people, right relationship with yourself, and also right relationship with creation. When they ate from the tree of good and selfishness, that unity is broken. So people will say, oh, God kicked them out of the Garden of Eden. That actually is not quite what the Hebrew says. We drove ourselves out of the Garden of Eden. We broke the unity. So therefore we can't live in a place of perfect unity. We did it to ourselves. That's not God's anger, that's our consequences. Does that make sense? That we distance ourselves from God. Or people could say, oh, you hear this all the time. God got angry with humanity, so he sent a flood. That's actually not what the Bible says. The Hebrew says that humanity's injustice against humanity caused the land, creation, to rebel against humanity. It doesn't say that God got angry with humans in humanity to each other. What it says literally is God was pained. Isn't that interesting? It doesn't say God got angry, it was pain. And humanity's cruelty pains God. And yes?
Will you repeat the thing you just said about humanity's, you said it's very specific. Humanity's something with humanity's what?
Oh, humanity's injustice against humanity. That causes the land creation to rebel against humanity. So it doesn't say God got angry, it says God got pained. We caused it ourselves. And our cruelty to each other causes God pain. So the flood was a human-caused event, not a God-caused event. Just like getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden was not a God-caused event, it was caused by us. So when the Bible is translated into English, the Hebrew gets turned backwards. and it's mistranslated that God caused the flood. There's this, shalom is this interconnectedness between our relationship to God is connected to our relationship with each other, which is connected to our relationship with creation. So when humanity sins against God, it affects both our relationship to each other and creation. When humanity sins against humanity, it affects our relationship with God and creation. And when humanity sins against creation, it affects our relationship between each other and God. It's all shalom. So when Noah gets off the boat, oh, do you get how that is a human-caused event? When Noah gets off the boat, there's this realization from God that humanity will always tend towards self-destruction. So the rainbow is a sign of God's covenant that God won't let us destroy ourselves. And the bow, like the rainbow, a lot of people didn't know this. The rainbow, the reason why it's called a rainbow, it's like an archer's bow. Does that make sense? And so the archer's bow, why, when we see it, we're supposed to recall God's promise, is where is the bow pointing to? God. It's not pointed at the earth. So the idea is the covenant with Noah shows that humanity will tend towards destruction, but God will draw closer to humanity, and God will suffer for humanity. The bow is pointed at God. So it's not a story of God's anger. It's a story of that God will suffer because of humans' cruelty. And this will be fulfilled in Christ's death. So the flood story is not a story of God's anger, but of God's sorrow. When people say God caused the flood, that's wrong on 2 points. It's humanity's cruelty that caused it. And it's God who will suffer, not get angry. Does that make sense? The third time God withdraws his protection is with Pharaoh, where, in English it doesn't really work out. Where in English you'll read that God will harden Pharaoh's heart. Does that, well, why would God do that to poor little Pharaoh? What it means is God is going to withdraw from Pharaoh, so Pharaoh will harden God's heart. I'll explain that next time. But sometimes God withdrawing his presence from us, Jen's worst vices become even worse. She'll become like a Vikings fan. Does that make sense? So when it says God hardened his heart, it's not that God hardened his heart. God withdrew everything that would prevent Pharaoh's ego from being softened. Does that make sense? So the fourth, and this is my favorite, the story of the serpents. Do you guys know the story of the poisonous snakes, the serpents? Is that a no or a yes? I gotta. Okay, well. So 40 years. You remember they have to live 40 years in the desert. So for 40 years they journeyed through the desert, and the people, once again, after 40 years, they start to complain about, and you have to always listen to the words, the manna, the water from the rock, and the desert. And they're complaining about that. It happens in Numbers 6. And they're complaining about the manna, so it says, God let go. And poisonous snakes came into the camp. So there's 2 main questions of this passage. Why snakes? You complain about the bread from heaven, and snakes come into the camp. How are those 2 things related? And what does it mean when it says God let go? So first, the poisonous snakes. Honestly, does that sound reasonable? Is that a reaction that's a little bit of overkill on God's part? It doesn't seem proportional that you complain about the bread of life and snakes come into the camp. It's really more like a James Bond villain. You know the James Bond movies where rather than just taking a gun and shooting him, he'd come up with this elaborate way of putting him to death by hooking lasers onto the head of salmons and making him swim. So like, if you wanted to destroy him, why not just destroy him? Why the poisonous snakes? But you have to remember that the only other time the phrase poisonous snakes is mentioned is in Deuteronomy 8. So towards the very beginning of this 40-year journey, Moses gives this speech. And listen to the words. Moses says, when you enter the promised land, you will have a surplus. You'll be tempted to forget God and think you did it all. You'll forget how God protected you in the desert from poisonous snakes and gave you water from the rock and the bread from heaven. So Moses' speech uses the very same words about the people's complaining that happens at the end of 40 years. So you have these two things, one at the beginning of the 40 years, one at the end of the 40 years. Always mention the same thing, the bread of heaven and the poisonous snakes and the water. And Moses says, don't forget what God has done. You'll be tempted because of your success to think you did it all. Don't forget. The only other passage in the Torah that mentions poisonous snakes is actually this part. So in English, when you read the story, it sounds like God got angry and sent poisonous snakes. However, if you read carefully, it's not about God's anger, it's about God's absence. That, wow, they didn't want the bread from heavens? Okay, you won't have it. You don't want the bread from heaven? Great. Does that make sense? And without the bread from heaven, it was the bread from heaven that kept the poisonous snakes away. The second part is that the Hebrew wording is strange. It doesn't say that God sent snakes. You can translate released snakes, but technically it just said God let go. What does he mean, God let go? That God let go snakes, or God let go of the people? Moses warns him, don't forget the presence of God. You think you'll do it all. Moses mentions at the beginning, poisonous snakes were all over the desert and never attacked because of God's presence. The bread from heaven was with them. So when it says God let go, it could mean that God let go of the people. That they didn't want the manna, and the manna prevented the snakes from coming into the camp. Then you won't have manna. It's as if the manna, the bread from heaven, was acting like this bubble that protected them. You think the crops came on their own? You think your borders are protected just by you alone? Why do they start to complain after 40 years of living in the desert? It's because they actually get to the edge of Edom, and there they see cities for the first time. Remember, they're the generation that spent in the desert. And they've always been pilgrims. And for the first time, they see these cities that look like great human achievements. And they never noticed that the snakes never came when the presence of the manna was there. And the idea is that maybe God's presence gives us millions of things that we can't even see until God's presence is taken away. Maybe God's presence protects us from a million things that we never even noticed that we didn't struggle with because God's presence was there. It's only in God's absence that we realize, oh, there are snakes all over the place. Does that make sense? To me, it's kind of like communism. Communism, they have this revolution, and they think, oh, thank God, with religion being dead because they outlawed religion, that suddenly there'll be this utopia. And yet, 60 to 80 million people died? Or, this sounds kind of strange, this Basque was telling me the story of growing up in Jordan Valley. And growing up in Jordan Valley, they were poor, but they went to church, and he said the strange part is we had poverty and hardship, but the family was always there for each other, and we went to church. Then, actually the Basques have done very well in Idaho. They do very well, the family stops going to church, and suddenly everything falls apart. It's when the people let go of God, even with their success, that everything fell apart. That's not a story of God's anger, that's a story of God's absence. And so the rabbis will call this the measure for measure theme, God's measure for measure. Now, Jesus mentions it first. Shakespeare takes it up and makes it a play. But it's this idea that, this is another concept. Measure for measure is the idea that what you inflict on other people will be inflicted upon you. Or it likes to say this in Psalm. You dig a pit and you fall in it yourself. So the Bible keeps repeating this phrase, and yet, does that mean God's anger? Because a lot of people will read it that, oh, you did this and God's going to punish you. You bend a little wire around a microphone and break it, and God is going to give you a canker sore. That's actually not, that's completely wrong. Measure for measure is this. What you plan, the destruction you plan for other people, is what will destroy you. That's not God's anger. That's consequences. So, like I did something, well, I've done a lot of horrible things, but once I kind of started this gossip. Now the problem is, you against somebody. The problem is that it wasn't false. It was true. So, when you're angry, you can say, I'm just telling the truth. But here's the worst part. And I knew in the back of my head, keep your mouth shut. And the worst part is that I felt so awful after I calmed down that it's not worth. I remember thinking measure for measure, I did that and I'm the one suffering, not the other person, because it just ruined everything in my day, actually a whole weekend. So you see this pattern that people ruin the land with violence, so the land ruins them. Pharaoh throws the firstborn of the Hebrew into the Nile, and it's Pharaoh's army that gets thrown into the Red Sea. Christ says, measure for measure. The measure you measure with will be measured out against you. So Christ means it in the sense of mercy and forgiveness. How generous you are is how generous God will be. In the Old Testament, it works the other way. How generous you are with your anger and revenge is what you're going to receive. So the real concept of measure for measure is articulated by Christ, but becomes among Jewish scholars this pattern of what we intend for others is inflicted upon us. And a lot of time people will say, well, see, that's God's anger. Well, no, that's a self-inflicted wound. That's not God. So what I'm trying to show you is, well, really, God gets angry in the Old Testament very few times. What God does allow is giving us what we want, hiding his face, or measure for measure. That's not God's anger, that's consequences. And so the idea of consequences is in this little phrase of handing us over. That's very Jewish. Paul keeps repeating that phrase. He loves the Paul, that handing us over. He summarized it this way, where he says, God hands people over to death. God actually gives people what they want, is what it means. So the biblical theme is God handing them over is that people get what they want and it destroys them. So the phrase giving over, St. Paul loves that one, that will experience a natural consequences to our decisions. So sometimes people read the Bible and kind of have this idea, well, really God should be covering up our mistakes, not make us realize the consequences from them. But is that a good parent? If a bad parent is always covering up the consequences of their child, the child, eventually just accuses the parent when things go wrong and they become vindictive. Does that make any sense? My mother would say this, my sister used it on her boys, I am not going to help you lie. Did you not know who I was? You think I'm going to help you lie? And it would come up a lot. I'm kind of surprised, even when Matt the oldest, was in first grade, and he wanted her to sign something, and it really was nothing big, but that he did his homework, and she says no. Because when you get raised with certain dichos, phrases that your parents use, you use it on your children, annoyingly. And so my sister says, oh no, I'm not going to help you lie. You can sit down right now and do the homework and be late from school, or you can, get a 0. And of course, little Matt throws his temper tantrum. You're the worst parent ever. And I said, well, isn't he going to be late for school? And he says, it only takes like 5 minutes to do the homework. He spent more time complaining than doing, but that's being handed over. So remember, when it says Pharaoh hardened his heart, that's simply a consequence of what he chose. The flood is God allowing, not causing. The scorpions are consequences of our poisonous complaints. So God withdrew his presence. So it's this idea, like, for example, if you get a sunburn, it's not the sun's fault that the sun is angry with you. That's a consequence of your actions. And a lot of times in the Bible, when people say God gets angry, no, it's just a consequence. A child might say the sun got angry with him and burned him, but we would know, no, that's just the way you're phrasing it. So, does God get angry a lot? The problem is if you take a few incidences that happened over centuries and put them back to back, I guess you can make that conclusion. But you have to remember the story unfolds over hundreds and hundreds of years. And how God's anger is actually setting this pattern of right and wrong. So I would actually say, no, when people say God seems so angry in the Old Testament, well, I don't know if it takes a century for him to get angry. The other issue is showing anger. It says God is slow to anger, not that he won't get angry, but is showing anger to a people wrong? I don't really think so. When Jen offends me, I let her know. It happens all the time. Or they did this psychological study that I thought was interesting, is sometimes, parents just lose it with a child, right? Somebody just told me, I can't tell that story, but this little boy did something that, yes, that would be what little boys do, right? So, you know what it is. We've all done it. This parent was saying that they just lost it. Just was screaming and couldn't believe that they could get so angry. It's nothing really that bad, but it does remind me that the psychological study with little kids is that sometimes getting angry is good with children because it changes their neural pathways and they remember, oh God, don't do that again. Yeah, but grandparents tend to have too much patience. And without a strong reaction, little kids won't remember. I'm not saying it's wise to overact with teenagers, but with little kids, they've actually found a little bit of overreaction may be good for them. They'll remember not to do it. So, you disagree?
I think grandparents are put on this earth to undo what the parents do to the children.
No, I meant parents then. The grandparents are too patient. We made that joke about my mother, because my mother moved next door to my sister to help the boys, which was great to have grandparents right next door. But, so my mother was kind of hard. She was a hard mother growing up. And with the boys, she was always so soft. And so my sister used to love to say, you are the weakest link. I just think that's so funny. And even so one of my close friends we were dinner with, their kids now are in, their 20s. And their mother, she was a hard mother, demanding mother. Anyhow, she was telling me the story. She says, no. And okay, so I don't have to. The mother's name is Joan, and the daughter's name is Catherine. So anyhow, Catherine and the grandparents lived close by. Catherine had her mother watch her oldest son to ask him, I'm going to be busy, could you pick him up from school and take him right home? So anyhow, because he had gotten in trouble, so he doesn't get a play afterwards, it's straight home. So anyhow, and Catherine sees that when she comes home, he's eating McDonald's French fries. And Catherine gets upset with her mother and says, what is that? She says, well, he really wanted to go to McDonald's. No, he doesn't get to go to McDonald's. She yelled at her mother, and mother said, I can't believe she yelled at me. She said, she actually made me cry. And I just think it's funny because Joan was very demanding. But with her grandchild, okay, let's stop by and get some fries. My only point being is that grandparents, I hate to say this, they're too soft. Parents, overreaction. What they found out is that, sometimes a little overreaction makes people remember. Maybe God works the same way. Anger is not the same thing as hatred. Anger sometimes displays justice. The Bible talks about God's anger and judgment as sometimes not being intertwined and sometimes it's entwined, which seems unfair, but I'm trying to make this point, that God shows a lot of acts of mercy immediately after getting angry. With Moses, immediately afterwards, stay away because he'll immediately offer forgiveness. So God does allow people to reject him and withdraw, and then scorpions. So sometimes God's withdrawing causes us justice, that we realize, wow, we made a poor decision. Sometimes God's anger comes quickly with mercy, but there's really no price to pay. Does that make any sense? But it's a way of remembering. The other last thing I want to mention is, should speed it up, is a righteous intercessor. You have this theme in the Old Testament of a righteous intercessor that compels God to turn away from his anger. Moses is this intercessor who refused to stop talking to God so God's anger won't build up. And then Aaron does the same thing. It comes kind of all together in this portrait of the Messiah in Isaiah, that humanity always needs somebody to be pleading their cause, to remind us and God that God is slow to anger, always wanting to forgive. I just love that image, that God is slow to anger, always wanting to forgive, but will not declare innocent those who are not innocent. And what I think, I'm going to try and end it with a reflection. So after the three classes, to kind of do reflections. One is about our prayer life. Well, morally. When people say, God gets so angry in the Old Testament, you can count him on two hands throughout the entire. A lot of times it's just consequences. So that's my first one. Second one is about our prayer life. And I do like that Philip Near thing of, don't give me what I want, give me what I need. Well, maybe our prayer life should be the same thing. Don't give me what I want. Let me want to do your will. But like Mother Teresa or St. Therese or St. Catherine, when you pray, thy will be done, that's thy will be done means don't give me what I want, give me what I need. And sometimes God has to hide his face so that our desire for God becomes more pure. So in your prayer life, don't worry if you don't have that euphoric feeling. As St. Therese says, that's not really your credit then. God's paying you to pray to him if you get a euphoric feeling, not to desire God for God's sake. The other thing is that, not everything is punishment. What if I was to get Alzheimer's, which is what I've always feared? Maybe that's what's going to make me a holy person. I know cancer made somebody else a holy person. My dad got Lou Gehrig's disease, which is one of the worst diseases. And, to be honest, he was a very difficult person until he had Lou Gehrig's disease. Maybe it's not what we want, but what we get is what we really need. Maybe God should hide his face. So in our prayer life, don't pray for anything except the desire for God. And lastly, just this reflection. God's anger speaks about love. God gets most angry with religious people. And that should strike you as strange. But somebody said this once, I think this is funny. If you're not yelling at your children, then you're not spending enough time with them. And the frequency of our anger is sometimes in proportion to those who have most of our heart. So, like a parent who's not yelling at his kid, maybe because the kid's in daycare and always away from the kid. Then you start noticing their faults and where they need to improve. God's anger speaks about God's love. Every time humanity fails, God binds himself even closer. God doesn't get angry with the pagans and I don't know, the other people. God gets angry with the people who made promises to him. That's a good thing. It binds us even closer. So God, even God's anger is a sign of God's love. Okay, so that's class 1 kind of intro, Old Testament, God's anger. God's anger is not like my anger. It's the opposite. And in some sense, God's anger saves us. It's God's absence that condemns us. Questions, opinions?
Amazing. So good. Good. You did really good.
Unclear? All right, go get angry then.
Father Len?
Yes.